Do unwanted sexual thoughts plague you, leaving you feeling powerless or ashamed? You scroll past, close the tab, and try to stop the craving, yet the thought lingers. Is it a lack of willpower, or is something much deeper at play? Carl Jung believed that sexuality is not just biological but profoundly archetypal and psychological. Your persistent sexual thoughts aren't the enemy, they are a messenger from your unconscious signaling a part of you that has been oppressed, shamed, or disowned. In this exploration, we dive into the Jungian map of the psyche. We'll examine how shadow, work, erotic shame, and the anima archetype reveal that lust isn't merely about pleasure, but about power. Discover how emotional numbness, unresolved trauma, and practices like semen retention can distort your relationship with desire. The goal is not abstinence, but true self-integration. By facing these forbidden thoughts, you begin a path toward wholeness. This isn't just about sex, it's about you. Why do sexual thoughts arise uninvited, and often at the worst times? Why? Does the mind fixate on lust even when we consciously try to resist it? To understand this, we need to go deeper than behavior biology, or even modern psychology. We must explore the realm of the unconscious as described by Carl Jung, a key figure in depth psychology, understanding the unconscious. Jung did not view the unconscious as just a container for forgotten memories or repressed desires. He saw it as a living part of the psyche, a force that actively communicates with the conscious mind through images, emotions, dreams, fantasies, and urges. Among the strongest expressions of this unconscious force are sexual thoughts. Sexual thoughts as symbols. Sexual thoughts are not simply biological reflexes or hormonal reactions. In Jungian psychology, they are messages from the unconscious, symbols that reveal hidden parts of the self we have not fully faced or embraced. Whom once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This idea is especially important when thinking about sexuality. Many people feel controlled by their sexual urges, stuck in cycles of guilt, obsession, or avoidance, but these thoughts are often not random. They reflect deeper, unresolved content in the psyche. For example, recurring fantasies about domination or submission might represent a split within the self, a hidden need for control or vulnerability. Taboo or forbidden sexual thoughts might point to early experiences of emotional confusion, trauma, or inner conflict between instinct and cultural norms. In Jung's view, sexual thoughts are not direct commands but symbolic messages. The divide between ego and desire, here lies the main tension. The ego or conscious self wants to be good, accepted, and in control, but the unconscious holds what the ego rejects: raw instincts, fears, desires, and pain. When sexual thoughts push into consciousness, they often carry the energy of the shadow. This is the part of the psyche made up of the traits we deny or disown. These thoughts are not just distractions or moral failures, they are invitations to recognize parts of ourselves we have ignored. Libido is life energy. Freud defined libido as sexual drive. Jung expanded this to mean psychic energy, the vital force behind all expression, including creativity, love, ambition, and spirituality. When this energy is repressed because of shame, trauma, or strict cultural rules, it does not vanish. It moves underground into the unconscious, where it begins to speak in symbols, often through sexual thoughts. So, recurring sexual thoughts may be signs of blocked energy trying to express itself. The mind does not return to these themes because you are flawed. It does so because something inside remains unseen, unheard, or unloved. Compulsion versus conscious desire. Many confuse compulsion with real desire. Jung made a clear distinction between the two. Compulsion feels like something that takes over the will. It is irrational and often leaves a sense of shame. Conscious desire is different. It is integrated and in tune with the true self. When sexual thoughts feel intrusive or overwhelming, they are often triggered by inner complexes. These are clusters of memories, emotions, and beliefs formed by past trauma, shame, or fear, rather than reacting with shame or blind indulgence. Jung suggested a third approach. Observe the thought. Ask yourself, what does this mean? What is trying to speak through this image or fantasy? This marks the beginning of self-awareness and healing. Sexual symbols in dreams and fantasy. Sexual images often appear in dreams or quiet moments. Jung saw this not as an error but as a clue. Dreams are a pure form of unconscious expression, and the images in them are often archetypal. They reflect deep patterns in the human psyche. Sexual images in dreams might represent inner feminine or anima, trying to connect with a man, a hidden need for closeness, trust, or emotional contact, a desire for tenderness or power, or even the memory of a past wound. Seen in this way, sexual thoughts are not problems, but puzzles. They are riddles from the soul, and the first step is to approach them with awareness. What happens when we ignore the unconscious? When we reject or suppress sexual thoughts, we push them deeper into the psyche. This builds pressure and can lead to unhealthy outcomes like addiction, emotional coldness, guilt, or risky actions. Jung warned that what we repress does not go away, it becomes fate. The more we deny these parts of ourselves, the more extreme their return. This does not mean every sexual thought should be acted upon, but understanding their source as essential. Repression is not transformation, only reflection can lead to change. The first step is awareness without judgment. The first step is not to fight or fix the thought, but to witness it without judgment. It's taught that every part of the psyche, even the darkest ones, must be seen. Instead of asking, how do I stop these thoughts? Ask, what is this thought trying to show me? What unmet need or wound might this reveal? What part of myself have I denied that now returns in this form? When we meet sexual thoughts with curiosity, instead of fear, we open the door to healing and integration in the shadows of the psyche. Sexuality often hides in chains. We live in a culture where sexuality is paradoxically everywhere, and yet deeply misunderstood. On the surface, sex is sold, celebrated, and commodified. But on a deeper level, beneath religious rules, childhood conditioning, and unspoken family dynamics, sexuality is often shrouded in shame, guilt, and silence. From a Jungian perspective, this isn't just a cultural issue, it's a psychological wound. One that buries desire into the unconscious, where it festers and mutates, emerging as compulsive fantasies, numbness, repression, or even addiction. To understand why we can't just stop sexual thoughts or habits, we must understand the relationship between repression, trauma, and erotic shame, and how these forces warp our sexual identity at the root. Repression, the original split. Carl Jung saw repression not merely as forgetting or denying something unpleasant, but as a core fracture within the psyche. The ego, our conscious self, constructs a self-image that fits the values of society, religion, family, or moral ideals. Anything that doesn't align with this acceptable identity is cast into the shadow. This includes a wide range of sexual material, forbidden desires, fantasies, fetishes, even simple bodily urges. For many, sexuality was never welcomed. It was judged, mocked, moralized, or punished, especially during the formative years of childhood and adolescence. If a child is caught touching themselves and is shamed for it, curiosity is labeled sinful. This doesn't make the desire disappear. Instead, it pushes it underground into the unconscious. There, it begins to take distorted forms. Jung warned that what is repressed does not die, it returns. And when it returns without consciousness, it does so with force. This is often the hidden engine behind unwanted sexual thoughts and behaviors. Trauma. The emotional imprint on desire. Trauma doesn't always mean catastrophic events. In psychological terms, trauma can be any experience that overwhelms the nervous system and is not fully processed or integrated. When it comes to sexuality, trauma is especially insidious. Sexual trauma may include direct abuse or violation, emotional incest, or boundary violations in childhood, religious indoctrination that demonizes the body, or desire cultural messages that link purity to worth-shaming by caregivers or authority figures. During moments of sexual curiosity, these experiences create deep emotional imprints often, without our conscious awareness. The body remembers what the mind forgets. As adults, we may find ourselves inexplicably aroused by shameful scenarios, unable to engage in intimacy without guilt, or addicted to pornography that reenacts a power dynamic we don't understand. In Jungian terms, these patterns reflect a traumatized inner child or a split-off part of the psyche that still carries the pain of repression. In other words, sexual trauma is not just about what happened, but what never got to be processed. The unconscious keeps replaying the emotional pattern until it's finally integrated. Erotic shame. Poison in the securitic shame is the inner belief that one's sexual self is bad, dirty, or unlovable. What's one of the most potent forms of shame because it attacks us at our core? Desire to love, to connect, to express, and to be accepted. Shame operates differently from guilt. Guilt says I did something wrong. Shame says I am something wrong. This is especially damaging in the realm of sexuality because it turns natural, instinctive energies into sources of self-hatred. Jung described this dynamic as a conflict between the archetypal instincts and the moral ideals of the ego. In many people, this conflict becomes a chronic psychic battle. Erotic shame leads to two main outcomes: hypersexual behavior, where sex is compulsively pursued as a way to soothe the shame, but only deepens it afterward. Sexual numbness or avoidance, where desire is suppressed completely, often leading to depression, disembodiment, or relational difficulties. The paradox is that shame and desire become entangled. What turns us on also disgusts us. What we long for, we fear. This creates a psychic loop of self-rejection, where we chase pleasure but sabotage intimacy. Jung believed that shame was often the soul's way of signaling that something repressed was trying to emerge. It's a protective mechanism, but also an invitation to deeper healing. The role of culture and religion, much of our sexual repression is inherited, not chosen. Generations of rigid religious teachings have framed sexuality as sinful, especially outside of marriage or heteronormative roles. Even today, many spiritual paths still treat sex as something to be overcome or renounced, rather than integrated from a Jungian lens. This creates a collective shadow, a cultural blind spot, where everyone pretends sex is either dirty or sacred, but never human. People are taught to be ashamed of their thoughts, to feel guilt for masturbation, or to view sexual fantasy as demonic. In Jung's terms, this creates an overinflated ego, one that tries to ascend too far into the light and disconnects from the earthy, instinctual truths of the body. The result is spiritual bypassing, repression, and eventually, collapse. The psyche cannot be divided forever. What we push down must come up. And when it does, it often arrives in the form of sexual confusion, obsession, or shame-driven fantasy. Fantasy is a coping mechanism when the real sexual self is repressed. The psyche often develops fantasy as a substitute. Fantasy allows the disowned parts of ourselves to find a voice, but only in secret, in Jungian terms. Fantasy is not merely escapism. It is a psychological theater where parts of the unconscious stage their drama. For example, a man who fantasizes about dominance may be expressing a disowned need for power or control. A woman who dreams of being taken may be yearning for surrender in a life where she's forced to stay in control. A person who craves taboo sex may be attempting to transgress the internalized parental superego that still governs their worth, rather than judging fantasies. Jung encouraged us to engage with them symbolically. What part of me is represented here? What unmet need, wound, or archetype is at play? Fantasy becomes pathological only when we refuse to explore its meaning. When integrated consciously, fantasy can become a portal to healing and creativity. Healing, erotic shame, integration over suppression. The path out of shame is not suppression, it is integration. Jungian psychology does not advocate for indulgence nor denial, but rather for conscious encounter. To begin healing erotic shame, we must identify the origin of our sexual wounds. When did shame first appear? Whose voice is it? Feel the emotions that were buried: grief, rage, humiliation, longing. Symbolically dialogue with fantasies instead of acting them out unconsciously. Bring sexuality into the light, not to exploit it, but to reclaim it. This often involves inner child work, shadow integration, and therapy that understands the psychological layers of sexual trauma, not just the behavioral symptoms. The goal is not to become sexually perfect, but to become sexually whole, to hold both our sacred and instinctual aspects without shame. Conclusion. The return of the repressed sexual thoughts that disturb, arouse, or confuse you may not be signs of dysfunction, but signs of repression, trauma, and shame finally seeking expression. Jung teaches us that the parts of ourselves we exile do not disappear. They return through dreams, compulsions, fantasies, and projections until we are ready to meet them. Reclaiming our sexual self is not about becoming more lustful or more pure. It's about becoming more aware, more honest, and ultimately, more human. Because on the other side of erotic, shame is not only healing, but liberation. In the quiet recesses of your mind just beyond the mask, you wear each day lives a part of you. You've spent the entire life trying to avoid. Carl Jung called this part the shadow it holds. Everything you've rejected, disowned, or repressed. And when it comes to sexuality, the shadow is often overflowing with unspoken cravings, unacceptable urges, buried fantasies, and primitive instincts. But the shadow does not simply sit in silence. It acts. It reaches through the unconscious and manipulates your choices, your attractions, and your emotional reactions. And one of the shadow's most subtle, powerful tools is projection. What is the shadow? Jung defined the shadow as the unknown dark side of the personality. It is not evil by nature, but it contains the parts of ourselves that the ego refuses to acknowledge. These might include jealousy, rage, and envisadism, masochism and lust, weakness, dependency, vulnerability and even strength, power and sensuality. If we were taught to suppress them in a sexually repressive society, it is common for sexuality itself to be relegated to the shadow. But here's the paradox. What you repress doesn't disappear. It becomes more dangerous because it operates outside of your awareness. Sexual shadow content can drive compulsive behavior, strange dreams, unconscious attraction, or even disgust toward others who express what we've denied in ourselves. And this is where projection enters the scene. What is sexual projection? Projection is the psychological mechanism where we unconsciously attribute our own traits, emotions, or desires to someone else. It's not conscious lying, it's a survival function. The ego protects itself from dissonance by saying, "That's not me, that's them." In sexuality, this often appears as sudden, irrational attraction to someone you barely know, avulsion. Toward people who are overtly sexual or provocative obsession with certain body types, roles, or dynamics, fantasies that seem unlike you, but keep resurfacing. Deep insecurity around others, sexuality feeling not enough or too much. What's happening here is not random. The shadow is projecting. It casts the repressed part of yourself onto someone else, allowing you to engage with your own sexual material at a distance. For example, a man who has repressed his desire for emotional vulnerability may become obsessed with women who seem soft, nurturing, or passive. She represents the part of himself he's denied. A woman who feels shame about her own sexual power might judge other women as slutty or inappropriate. In reality, she's seeing her disowned feminine fire reflected in them. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Projection is a mirror. It shows us what we've hidden. Why sexual projection is so powerful. Projection is one of the most emotionally charged forms of projection because it's tied to both pleasure and shame. When you project your sexual shadow onto another person, you may feel drawn to them with irrational intensity, afraid of what they awaken in you, conflicted, wanting them but judging them, confused about why you can't stop thinking about them often. This creates the illusion of chemistry or soul connection, but what's really happening is that your unconscious is trying to reclaim itself through the other. This is why people often fall in love with partners who reflect their disowned traits, only to later become resentful, triggered, or distant. Attraction, in Jungian terms, is not just about compatibility, it's about integration. We are magnetically pulled to people who carry our missing pieces: sexual projection and fantasy many. Sexual fantasies are rooted in projected shadow, content. You may fantasize about domination because you've disowned your own desire for control. You may crave submission because you've repressed your longing for surrender. You may be aroused by taboo dynamics because those are the very parts of yourself you were forbidden to explore. Fantasy becomes the mind's, a way of safely touching the shadow without having to fully admit or accept it. But when we take our fantasies, literally, or act on them unconsciously, we miss the deeper opportunity. To understand what the fantasy symbolizes in our inner world, Jungian psychology urges us to treat fantasies not as prescriptions but as invitations. Every erotic image has a message. Every intense desire carries symbolic weight. The goal is not to act out every fantasy but to explore what they represent about your unintegrated self. Dangers of unconscious projection. Unconscious sexual projection is not only psychologically confusing, it can be dangerous. When we project our shadow onto others, we risk idealizing or dehumanizing them, losing touch with reality and relationship centering. Toxic dynamics based on unmet needs, perpetuating cycles of lust, shame, and abandonment. Worst of all, projection keeps us from taking responsibility. As long as they are the source of our desire or disgust, we avoid the real work, facing what lives within. Jung warned that an unintegrated shadow would sabotage individuation. Projection is a natural function, but staying in projection means staying fragmented. Bringing back the projection. Integration works so. How do we stop projecting and start integrating? The first step is to recognize the pattern. Ask yourself, what types of people sexually trigger or overwhelm me? What qualities do I find most unacceptable in others yet secretly envy or obsess over? When do I feel the strongest emotional charge? Attraction, repulsion, jealousy. These are signs that projection is occurring. The next step is to withdraw the projection. This means saying, wait, what if this is not about them, but about me? That doesn't mean you lose interest or pretend your attraction isn't real, but it reframes the experience. Instead of chasing the other person to complete you, you turn inward and ask, what part of myself am I seeing in them? What traits, desires, or archetypes have I not fully owned? What would it mean to embody what I admire or fear in that person? This is the beginning of shadow integration, reclaiming your lost energy and bringing it back into consciousness. Sexual shadow. Work. A spiritual task in Jungian psychology. Integrating the shadow is not just a therapeutic exercise, it's a spiritual necessity. Without integration, you cannot reach individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole, unified self. Sexual shadow work involves exploring fantasies symbolically rather than acting them out, blindly examining your attractions and triggers with honesty doing, inner dialogues with parts of yourself you've rejected, for example, the slut, the beast, the innocent, releasing moral judgment and replacing it with conscious awareness. Remember, the shadow is not your enemy. It holds your creative force, vitality, and sexual energy, but only when owned. In fact, many people discover that their most authentic, grounded sexuality only emerges after integrating the very parts they were once ashamed of. Inside, every man lives a woman he does not know. She appears in his dreams, his fantasies, and most often in the women he loves, desires, or obsesses over. She is not a literal woman, but a powerful psychological force that Carl Jung called the anima, the unconscious feminine aspect of the male psyche. To understand sexual thought, compulsion, fantasy, or even romantic obsession through a Jungian lens, we must understand the anima, because often, what a man chases in women is not just a body or a personality, but a projection of his own missing soul. This is not romantic poetry. It's psychological fact. The anima is the gatekeeper to a man's inner world. And unless she is understood and integrated, she will control his love life, his sexual urges, and his emotional well-being. From the shadows, What is the anima? In Jungian psychology, the anima is the archetype of the feminine within the unconscious of a man, just as the animus is the archetypal masculine within a woman. These are not just gendered traits, they are symbolic structures representing deep aspects of the psyche. The anima embodies everything the male ego often represses or devalues, such as emotion, intuition, receptivity, sensuality, creativity, vulnerability, chaos, relational depth, spiritual connection. She is the opposite. The masculine, the egoic structure of control, logic, and achievement. And because these traits are often discouraged in boys and men, especially in rigidly masculine societies, the anima becomes disowned. She is buried in the unconscious, only to rise again in disguise through fantasy obsession or erotic projection. The anima and romantic obsession. Have you ever fallen for someone with intensity that felt irrational, like you barely knew them, but you couldn't stop thinking about them? This is not simply falling in love. It is often a projection of the anima. Jung noted that many men fall in love not with the actual woman in front of them, but with the image she evokes, an internal symbol of his feminine soul. The woman becomes a screen onto which he projects his longing for emotional wholeness, depth, and connection. This is why early-stage infatuation feels so magical. The man is not just meeting another person, he is encountering a part of himself that he has longed for. But projection is never sustainable. As the relationship progresses, the illusion breaks. The woman begins to reveal her real, complex self, and the man may feel confused, betrayed, or disappointed. He might say, "You've changed," when really, it was his fantasy that is dissolving. This is the anima's paradox. She lures the man into deeper connection, not with her, but with his own soul. Porn, fantasy, and the enemy in the digital age. The anima often finds expression through pornography and sexual fantasy. For many men, porn becomes a ritual, not just for pleasure, but for escape. The screen offers an endless supply of feminine archetypes: the nurturing mother, seductive lover, the innocent girl, the dominating woman. But Jung would ask, what are you really searching for? Beneath the physical arousal is usually a psychic hunger, a longing to connect with the lost parts of the soul. Pornography provides an illusion of intimacy without the vulnerability of real emotional contact. It mimics the anima's energy, but never fulfills it. Over time, this creates anima inflation, where the internal feminine becomes overactivated and distorted, leading to obsessive sexual fantasies, emotional dependency on external validation, depression, when the fantasy collapses in ability to bond with real women's sense of inner emptiness or creative blockage. Semen. Retention advocates often talk about sexual transmutation, but without addressing the anima, this transformation remains superficial. You cannot transmute what you refuse to face. The key is not suppression, but integration. Stages of anima development. Jung outlined a progression in the development of the anima in men. These stages reflect how the internal feminine evolves from primitive projection to mature integration. Eve, the biological woman. She represents the instinctual and erotic, often tied to the man's mother complex. This is the stage of sexual attraction and basic need. Helen, the romantic. She is beautiful, alluring, and desirable. Men in this stage often idealize women and pursue them as objects of affection. Mary, the spiritual woman. She represents virtue, purity, and emotional depth. The man begins to seek a partner who is also a guide or mirror to his soul. Sophia, the wise woman. She is fully integrated. The man no longer projects his inner feminine, but carries her within as emotional depth, creativity, and spiritual maturity. Most men get stuck in the early stages, forever projecting the anima onto women and never reaching true individuation. But when a man engages in deep shadow and anima work, he begins to embody Sophia and becomes whole. The dangers of an unintegrated anima when the anima remains unconscious. She can become destructive, seductress archetype. The man becomes addicted to women who are emotionally unavailable or manipulative. He craves the high of the fantasy. but is trapped in cycles of heartbreak, emotional dependency. He looks to women to save him or give his life meaning. Placing enormous pressure on romantic relationships, creative blockage, the anima is also the muse. If ignored, men often lose access to their imagination, intuition, and inner life. Narcissistic collapse without the anima's grounding, the ego inflates. When fantasy meets reality, the fall is devastating. This is why Jung said the anima must not only be recognized, but reclaimed. How to integrate the anima integration is a lifelong process. It begins when a man stops seeking the perfect woman and starts turning inward. Here's how this process can unfold. 1. Withdraw the projection. Notice your patterns. Who are you drawn to repeatedly? What do they represent? Are you falling for a person or your idea of them? Begin to see the projection and call it back too. Dialogue with the anima in Jungian inner work. You can literally speak with the anima in dreams, journaling, or active imagination. Ask, "What are you here to teach me? What do you want from me?" She will often appear in symbolic form, a voice, a dream woman, a feeling. Listen. 3. Embody her qualities. Bring her traits into your conscious life. Creativity, softness, empathy, sensuality, receptivity, intuition. Begin to live your inner feminine, not just seek it outside yourself. Embrace emotional vulnerability. The anima is deeply emotional. To integrate her, you must feel what you've avoided. Grief, love, fear, longing, these are the keys to reclaiming her 5. Create art, music, or ritual. The anima expresses herself through beauty and soul. Write, paint, dance, express. Give her voice in your creative life. The gift of the anima. Wholeness when a man integrates the anima. He becomes more than just masculine. He becomes complete. He no longer needs to dominate or seduce. He no longer fears women or worships them. He meets them as equals, because he has already met the woman within. This is the core of Jung's concept of individuation, to become whole. Not by denying polarity, but by unifying it. The anima is not just a sexual force. She is the bridge to your inner world, your emotional life, your dreams, and your soul. Without her, you are half a man clever. Strong, capable, but lost. With her, you become a vessel for depth, presence, and real love. Semen retention is not just a discipline of the body, it is a battle for the soul, in a culture of instant gratification and compulsive pleasure-seeking. The idea of abstaining from ejaculation can seem extreme, even archaic, but when viewed through the lens of Jungian depth psychology, semen retention becomes something much more profound, a path toward the integration of the unconscious, the transmutation of lust, and ultimately, the reclamation of psychic energy. At the center of this work lies a radical question. What if lust isn't the problem, but a misunderstood signal from the soul? Semen retention. A modern discipline with ancient roots, the idea of conserving sexual energy is not new. Yogic traditions call it brahmacharya. Taoists practice Jing preservation. In Christian mysticism, celibacy was seen as a gateway to divine communion. But modern interpretations, particularly in the nofep and semen retention communities, often reduce the practice to a behavioral tactic for gaining more confidence, testosterone, or female attraction. While these surface benefits may occur, they are byproducts, not the point. From a Jungian standpoint, semen retention is not about suppression, it's about transformation. The libido, Jung's concept of psychic energy. Jung did not equate libido solely with sex. He defined it as psychic energy, the life force that fuels desire, imagination, emotion, and spiritual aspiration. When we fixate on sexuality in a purely physical or hedonistic sense, we remain trapped at a lower vibration of libido. It becomes compulsive, repetitive, and draining. But when this energy is withdrawn from purely sexual expression and consciously redirected, It can be sublimated, transformed into creativity, insight, healing, or purpose. Jung wrote, "The libido, which was previously in a sexual form, now appears in the form of a spiritual striving. As a longing for higher consciousness, this process is not instant. It demands awareness, discipline, and confrontation with the shadow side of desire, lust as repressed energy most. People don't feel lust, they are possessed by it. The modern world is flooded with stimuli that inflame the sexual instinct, but provide no real outlet for emotional intimacy or meaning. In Jungian terms, this creates a psychic inflation, an overload of repressed energy that erupts through obsession, compulsion, or fantasy. Lust, then, is not the enemy. It is a signal that energy is accumulating, often due to emotional repression, creative blockage, or disconnection from purpose. In shadow work, we learn that many compulsive sexual thoughts are not actually about sex. They are cries for connection, longings for power desires, for surrender, echoes of childhood neglect, reactions to anxiety, boredom, or inner emptiness. When a man begins semen retention, he removes the easy escape and is forced to confront the deeper forces underneath his lust. This is where the true work begins. Psychological alchemy, transmuting sexual energy. Often spoken in the language of alchemy, the symbolic process of transforming base materials lead into gold. Psychologically, it refers to the process of turning raw instinct into spiritual insight. Sexual energy is the prima materia, it's the base substance of transformation in the alchemical process. Calcination. Lust is burned away by awareness and self-discipline. Separation. The man distinguishes real desire from trauma-driven compulsion. Conjunction. Unites the opposites, pleasure and discipline. Masculine and feminine. Instinct and spirit. Sublimation. The energy rises, becoming inspiration, focus, or even divine union. This is the deeper purpose of semen retention, not to suppress sex, but to elevate it from the genitals to the soul. The shadow side of retention. It's important to note that semen retention can itself become a shadow game when used to boost ego, gain control over others, or judge those who don't practice it. It becomes another form of inflation, spiritual bypassing. Disguised as self-discipline, Jung warned against repressing the libido without inner transformation. Repression without integration leads to projection. Seeing others as temptations or enemies of your purity, rigidity, losing touch with play, spontaneity, and joy neurosis. The libido finds other ways to erupt: anxiety, insomnia, rage, spiritual pride, believing you are above sexual desire. While secretly still haunted by it, the goal is not to deny sexual energy, but to hold it consciously, to sit with the fire without being consumed by it, to become the alchemical vessel that can contain and transform it. Retention and the anima. In earlier sections, we explored the anima, the feminine aspect of the male psyche. Semen retention intensifies contact with her. Why? Because in the absence of sexual release, the libido turns inward. Dreams become more vivid. Emotional waves rise. Repressed content begins to surface. The anima stirs. This can be euphoric, full of creative breakthroughs, visionary insights, and emotional healing. But it can also be destabilizing. Men may become moodier, confused by sudden bursts of nostalgia, sadness, or even sexual obsession. This is natural. You are not losing control. You are beginning to feel. The anima is awakening. And with her, so is your soul. Retention and individuation. Jung's ultimate aim was individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated person. Sexual energy plays a central role in this journey. It is the fuel of transformation, the drive behind the quest for meaning, the longing for union, not just with others, but with the self, through semen retention. A man learns to reclaim his body from unconscious compulsion. Reframe. Lust as symbolic longing. Redirect his libido into creative and spiritual pursuits. Reintegrate the feminine within. Hold tension between desire and transcendence. In doing so, he moves from fragmentation to integration, From boyish gratification to masculine embodiment, from external chasing to internal sovereignty, the body is temple, not battlefield. Many men treat their bodies like battlegrounds, fighting their instincts, hating their lust, fearing their thoughts. But the Jungian path teaches us to see the body as a temple, a sacred vessel where spirit meets matter. Where psyche meets soma, semen is not just fluid, it is life force, loaded with archetypal power. To waste it carelessly is to treat the sacred as disposable. To retain it consciously is not repression, it is reverence. But reverence must be paired with insight. Retention without reflection becomes rigidity. Reflection without retention becomes fantasy. Together, they create transmutation. Sexual fantasy is not just about desire, it's about wounds. It often forms in the emotional aftermath of unmet needs, repressed feelings, and internalized shame. We imagine what we cannot express. We eroticize what we're afraid to confront. And over time, fantasy can become not just a source of pleasure, but a psychic coping mechanism, often hiding the deepest parts of our unresolved trauma. According to Carl Jung, the psyche never lies. Even our wildest fantasies hold symbols of our inner life if we are willing to look. But most people don't look. They escape, and that escape becomes numbness, not just to sexuality, but to life itself. The function of fantasy in the Jungian psychology treats fantasy not as meaningless indulgence, but as a language of the unconscious. Fantasies arise when conscious life becomes disconnected from instinct, emotion, or spiritual truth. They are messengers, often dramatic, erotic, or exaggerated, that reflect our split self. There are three major functions of fantasy. Compensation. Fantasy often compensates for what is lacking in real life. If you feel powerless, you might fantasize about domination. If you feel emotionally neglected, you might fantasize about being wanted or needed. Symbolic expression. Fantasies encode inner dynamics in symbolic form. A forbidden act in fantasy may reflect a desire for liberation, not literal action, rehearsal, or integration. The psyche may use fantasy to prepare for integration, helping you explore shadow material in symbolic space before you're ready to live it consciously. So, what you fantasize about matters? Not because it defines who you are, because it points to who you could become if you had the courage to face what lives behind the fantasy. Shame. The invisible wall, but that's where shame steps in. Sexual shame is one of the most powerful and corrosive psychic forces in human life. It often begins in childhood through subtle messages from parents, religion, or culture. Don't touch that. You're dirty. Good girls. Boys don't do that. Desire is dangerous. Sex is sinful unless it's within strict moral lines. Over time, a child learns to disconnect desire from self-worth. They internalize the belief that to feel turned on, curious, or sensual makes them bad. So what happens? They push it into the shadow. But the shadow doesn't delete desire. It buries it and twists it. This buried desire then re-emerges later in life as erotic obsession, compulsive porn use, addiction, too specific. Kink's fear of intimacy, a sense of being emotionally or sexually broken. This is why. In Jungian therapy, shame is not just an emotion to be managed. It is a portal to your shadow, and often to your deepest unmet emotional needs. Fantasy is a shame container for many people. Sexual fantasy becomes the only place they feel safe enough to feel again. Not just arousal, but intimacy, excitement, power, surrender, or even vulnerability. But because that experience is happening in a disembodied, secretive, and shameful space, it reinforces the split between self and desire. Fantasy becomes both escape and prison. This is why people can develop compulsive relationships to porn or fantasy. Not because they're broken, but because they've never been taught to meet their own emotional, erotic, and psychological needs in reality. They're chasing connection in the only place they've learned to survive. But the problem isn't the fantasy itself, it's that it's unconscious. Emotional numbness. The cost of repression. You bury desire in shame. You don't just numb sexuality, you numb everything. Desire is life energy. When it's repressed, you may experience a flat emotional range disconnection from the body, depression or apathetic difficulty forming real emotional intimacy and inability to feel deep pleasure. Even in non-sexual life, this is especially common in men who have internalized the message that real men don't feel or that emotions are weak. So they suppress the feminine aspect of their psyche, the anima, and lose access to the emotional landscape that gives color and meaning to life.
What's left is a kind of psychic deadness masked by productivity.
Intellect or control, but internally hollow. This is the true danger of repression. Not just that you stop feeling desire, but that you stop being alive to yourself. The shadow behind fantasies. So, what do you do with a fantasy that won't go away? Jungian psychology invites you to explore it symbolically. Not to act it out blindly, nor to repress it in shame, but to understand what it represents. For example, a fantasy about being dominated may reflect a longing to surrender control or responsibility. A fantasy about taboo acts may symbolize a desire to rebel against rigid moral codes. A fantasy about seducing others might express a need to feel desirable, seen, or empowered. Each fantasy is a mirror, showing you a disowned part of yourself. Rather than asking, "What's wrong with me?" ask, "What part of me is trying to speak through this fantasy?" This is the start of shadow integration, bringing your unconscious desires into awareness. With compassion and curiosity, healing shame through conscious awareness to dissolve sexual shame. You must first bring it into the light, Jung wrote, until you make the unconscious conscious. It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Begin by naming your shame. What are you most afraid others would know about your sexual self? What fantasies make you uncomfortable to admit, even to yourself? Where did you learn that those desires were wrong? Then ask, is that belief true or inherited? Much of our sexual shame is not ours. It comes from parents, religion, trauma, or media. By bringing those beliefs into consciousness, you begin to detach from them. You start to re-own your sexuality, not as sin, but as signal. Moving from fantasy to feeling, Jung emphasized the importance of feeling as a path to individuation. When sexual fantasy is explored symbolically and shame is released, you begin to reaccess real emotional depth. You feel grief for the years you spent hiding. You feel anger at those who shamed you. You feel fear of showing your true self, and you feel desire not compulsively, but clearly, consciously, authentically. This is where numbness ends. In the heart, not the genitals. Integration. Becoming whole against sexuality is not separate from the soul. In Jungian psychology, erotic energy is deeply tied to the journey of individuation, becoming a whole, integrated being. To integrate fantasy and dissolve shame, reflect symbolically. What does the fantasy represent emotionally, spiritually, symbolically? Practice active imagination. Engage with the fantasy as a dialogue. What does that part of you want, need, or fear? Feel what was numbed. Allow grief, longing, rage, or joy to emerge. Fantasies often protect buried emotions, embody new choices, explore safe, conscious ways to bring those desires into life, not to act them out blindly, but to express the part of you they point to. This process reclaims lost energy. It softens the rigid ego, and it opens the door to intimacy, not just with others, but with your deepest self.